Please welcome your panelists for Art, Politics, and Popular Culture, moderated by CNBC Senior Media and Entertainment Correspondent, Julia Boorstin.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We have an amazing group of panelists who are the perfect voices to discuss the powerful role that art is playing right now, influencing politics, reacting to politics, and influencing pop culture. I want to thank our panelists for being here: Sophia Bush, George Takei, Sarah Gubbins, and Damon Lindelof. Thank you all so much for being here. And unfortunately, Lee Daniels is sick, so he is not here. We did get to see a little bit of him in that video, but I'm sure some of the themes that he addresses in his art will be able to weave into our conversation today. On the way over here, when I was stuck in traffic, both Sarah and I were listening to a segment on NPR about the 50th anniversary of Hair, and how that musical, I don't know if any of you were also stuck in traffic listening to NPR, but it was really interesting listening about the very influential role this musical had on both the conversation about the war in 1968, but also in the way people thought of what was at the time a fringe movement of hippies. And this was a play that was quickly sort of adopted by the mainstream, or sort of accepted by the mainstream, and really changed the conversation. And here we are at a moment of great political intensity, and all of our panelists here are using their art to talk about and to interact with politics, and also using the platform that they are provided. But I think it's interesting to reflect on how art has always served this purpose and been very important in this way. And Sarah, I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been doing with your list, and for you as a playwright, explaining why sort of you have used theater and your list in particular to address sort of politics and equality.
Sure. The funny thing about that news story about Hair was that they were talking about what plays were on Broadway at the time, and Hello Dolly was, and Hello Dolly still is on Broadway, which is wonderful that we have classics. But it was in that kind of environment where a bunch of playwrights that had recently moved to Los Angeles, because the television industry is a huge magnet now for playwrights, and has been probably for the last 10 years, I look to you. And we were out here, and we were noticing that we were not getting productions. The gender parity in the American theater was stymied. And year after year after year, women were dramatically underrepresented. And there had been a new play boom in the American theater, but female and non-cis male playwrights were not being represented in that boom. And so we really were inspired by being out here and the Blacklist, and which is a list, for those of you who don't know, there's a list every year that gets kind of published that is all of the agencies and production companies and different producers submit their favorite unproduced screenplay. So it's the thing that they love most, but they couldn't get off the ground, or just whatever. And so and they publish this list, and as a result of that, a lot of those movies get made. And we thought, okay, well, why don't we just do this for plays? Why don't we ask theater, artistic directors, and all of those gatekeepers in lit departments across the country to give us their favorite unproduced play by female and non-cis male writers, and we'll just put together a list based on, tally it. We didn't pick it. We just orchestrated it. And as a result, what happened was we have this list that's kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval on it. And I think we've done 5 of them. And in the time that we started to now, the writers on that list have gotten productions like across the country. So it was a really simple gesture, but and it was really imitating something that we were seeing happening in Hollywood. And yet, I say that, and there's so much more. I mean, the numbers still aren't dramatically moving.
And because the list represents a more diverse group of playwrights, is the content have different messages, or?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, these voices that get a platform. You know, I'm thinking of like writers like Dominic Mousseau. You know, just there's perspectives and representations and of experiences, and not only that, there's different ways of storytelling, and you know, so you're not imitating the same kind of well-made play. Not to say that that's not being done, but it gives boards at theaters a little bit more. They feel empowered. You know, they feel like, well, the theater community really loves these plays. I get to tell my board here and my theater that this is, my trustees, that this is something we should be supporting.
It seems like in the category of how art and politics or culture interact, there are these two ways of doing it. There's with art that sends a message, sometimes more overtly, sometimes more subtly, and then there's also in the role of people using their platform to tweet, as George and Sophia do, and directly say, I have people paying attention to me, and therefore I'm going to use this attention to communicate a specific belief or spread information that I think is valuable and important. And George, you are doing both. I follow you on Twitter. I recommend everyone follow George on Twitter, as well as Sophia. Everyone follow George and Sophia on Twitter. But also, you have this play on Broadway right now.
We played on
Sorry,
Broadway.
the play which is now off.
We just closed the Los Angeles.
So tell us about this play and why it was so important for you to take your message and perform it in a theatrical setting.
Well, I envy you, your complaint that women weren't being represented. You know, Asians and Asian Americans weren't visible at all, except in terms of stereotypes created from the white lens.
Yes.
When I was 5 years old, I was categorized by my government, the United States, as an enemy alien. I was born here in Los Angeles. My mother was born in Sacramento, California. My father was born in Japan, but he was brought to San Francisco by my grandparents as a boy. He was reared in San Francisco. He was educated in San Francisco, and he called himself a San Franciscan throughout his life, despite the fact that he's lived most of his life in Los Angeles. We're Americans, and yet, because Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and we happen to look like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor, we were categorized as enemy aliens. But despite that, young Japanese Americans, like all young Americans, rushed to their recruitment centers to volunteer to serve in the US military. This act of patriotism was answered with a slap on the face. They were denied military service and categorized as enemy aliens. And then they came down with the curfew. We had to be home by 7 p.m. and remain home until 6 a.m. In the morning. We were imprisoned in our homes at night. And then we discovered that our bank accounts were frozen. Our life savings was taken away from us. We couldn't pay our mortgage, couldn't even get a few dollars to meet our daily living expenses. And then this hysteria went all the way up to the presidency of the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of the US, who did great things in the 30s, pulling the nation out of a crushing depression, signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, roughly 120,000 of us, to be summarily rounded up with no charges, therefore no trial. You need charges to challenge in the court of law. And so we had no due process, which is the pillar of our justice system. And we were rounded up and imprisoned in 10 barbed wire prison camps in some of the most hellish places in this country. Our family was sent to the swamps of southern Arkansas. From that, in one lifetime, because of the ideals of our democracy, I am able to sit here together with these accomplished people discussing the intersection of culture and politics and art. This is an amazing country, and it is the ideals, the shining ideals of our democracy that makes possible this kind of discussion. I, who grew up as an enemy alien imprisoned in US prison camps, guarded over by sentries with machine guns pointed at us. When I made the night runs to the latrine, searchlights followed me. It was a prison camp. And it wasn't just the imprisonment itself. When the war ended and we were released, the hostility and the hate was still intense. We were, first of all, impoverished, and we were hated. The government gave us $25 and a one-way ticket to wherever in the United States we wanted to go to. My parents decided to come back to Los Angeles. Our first home was on Skid Row in downtown LA, which was terrifying to us kids because children are amazingly adaptable. We had adjusted to the routine and the regimentation of imprisonment. But Skid Row was chaos, sheer horror, terror all the time. People bellowing, yelling at each other, sirens screaming day and night. At night, our Skid Row room would suddenly glow red with the light from the police car. Scary, smelly, ugly people were leaning on walls, sprawled on sidewalks, staggering about. From that, because of my parents' struggle to get back on their feet. And it was also the craziness of me wanting to have an acting career. And in with an acting career, luck plays a big part. I was cast in Star Trek, a show with ideas.
And you brought that story of your youth to the theater.
Broadway theater.
And to Broadway theater. And what was the response that you found? You were educating people about a horrible part of American history that is often not focused on enough. Did you feel like you had the impact that you wanted to in telling that story?
We did. We first premiered at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego. And there we broke their 80-year box office record. However, when we transferred to Broadway, we had a very unique situation. We opened shortly after Hamilton opened. Also talking about American history, also talking about transformation, also a powerful commentary about America. But it sucked all the oxygen out. We lasted for 4 months. And we did all right, but we broke no records. We transferred to Los Angeles, and we ran for 3 months here, and we had a sellout run, primarily because LA has the largest concentration of Japanese Americans, and therefore the largest number of families that were touched by the incarceration. And so we broke all records. And so this, within a 70-year period, this kind of transformation of public attitudes from being categorized as enemy aliens to box office sensation can happen.
Pretty amazing. Now, Sophia, you also use Twitter as a platform to talk about things that you are passionate about, and you also make choices about what kinds of projects you want to do. How do you see these two parts of your life as an actor and as an activist working together?
Well, I think, first of all, I was really fortunate to grow up here in LA, in a city that, to George's point, is truly a melting pot. And I grew up the daughter of an immigrant and of a first-generation American whose family is all immigrants. And my dad's a photographer. I grew up in a community of artists. And that meant people of all sort of socioeconomic classes, races, genders, sexual preferences. And as I got older and started to realize that people attacked other people for their differences rather than realizing that those are the things that make life really interesting. I'm like, I don't want vanilla ice cream every day. Why do you? I realized that it's always art that makes a change, whether it's artists who speak up, who tell stories that teach people about people who they've previously defined as other. Even in the world of sports, think about the strides that athletes have made in the civil rights movement. So to me, it's always been clear that I can't spend my day doing something that I don't agree with morally. Even if I'm playing someone who's the kind of person I can't agree with, I want to tell the reasons why they behave in such a way. I want to witness them transform. I want to see somebody be a lesson in who they are as a character. You know, think about Bryce Dallas Howard playing that awful woman in The Help. She taught people a lesson in her awfulness in the same way that we need our heroes to teach us things. And when social media first started, I thought it was sort of, pardon my French, but really masturbatory. I was like, who cares what anybody's eating for breakfast? Which is ironic now, considering the number of chefs I follow, because I'm like, pictures of food are amazing. I was wrong. But when Deepwater Horizon happened, and I'd been doing so much work in the Gulf with Global Green prior to that, and I flew down there and I realized that everything we were seeing on the news was a lie. And I could not believe what I was witnessing versus what we were showing people. And I went, oh, this is what Twitter's for. So that's why I joined. I joined for cause. And similarly to Instagram, any platform really offers you a space to have a conversation in longer than a soundbite, to have conversations sometimes more deeply than we do with the lessons our characters are teaching over a season. And it really, I think, in an era where transparency, whether we're thinking about the way we live or our data privacy or anything, matters more and more, it's really important to stand up and have a conversation about what you believe in. And I do kind of look at it as a social responsibility. You know, we were just speaking prior to the panel starting about what it means to carry the stories of our prior generations and tell them authentically. Not everybody's using social media for that. You know, if you're using it for a brand, like, good for you. I hope you're successful. But I also think we have a responsibility to do the right thing. And in an era where things are getting more and more combative, to show up with facts, science, that's fact. Funny how that works. To really go out on a limb. And it can be risky. And it can be a thing that the people who are going to hire you say, oh, that person's a little hot on whatever issue. And I'm like, cool, okay, that's fine.
And do you think it's impacted the way you choose projects and also the way producers or studio chiefs think about hiring you? Do they understand that you're going to have opinions about a lot more things than maybe other actors would?
I don't really know, probably. I'm sure that's like a conversation I'm not privy to. It definitely impacts the way I choose roles. I have plenty of scripts come across my desk, and I'm just like, no, I can't. I don't want to.
Because of the messages the scripts send?
It's the message or it's the lack thereof. And for me, anything can have a message. I mean, you know, as a kid who grew up loving comic books, as much as I loved really weird, quirky stories, look at Black Panther. That's a superhero movie, but it is full of messages. It is hitting every nail on the head. You can make a big blockbuster film that teaches people something, certainly. But yeah, when I read the next sort of generic horror script that feels like torture porn, I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do this movie. Thank you so much for the offer. I'd like rather stay home with my dog. Yeah. You know, and it makes me think, especially I think so many of us come from television where you have the luxury of really digging into stories that are complex, that can feel ugly, that can really make people confront themselves and who they are as humans in the good, the bad, and the ugly. That I think of as such a privilege, but it is the reason that I want to make thoughtful, smart television. You know, we're seeing clips of 2 shows you guys have made that are thoughtful, engaging, and whether they're in really serious, heavy spaces or even in the space of comedy, comedy's wickedly smart when done well. And I think so many of us just want to show up and lend our voices to things that, whether they're people wearing capes, people making you laugh, or people talking about the ins and outs of impending death. We want it to matter. We don't just want it to feel like vanilla.
Damon, how do you approach this in your work? I mean, when I think back at watching Lost a decade ago or however long ago that was, and the messages you're weaving in there about interpersonal relationships and society and sort of how you're doing it now with The Leftovers, how do you think about the messages you're trying to send? And especially right now, being able to do it on television, which is so different than it was a decade ago.
To be completely candid, I think I was 30 years old when JJ and I created Lost, and I wasn't approaching it from a point of view of intention or messaging. It was just, it felt like a runaway train, and at the time, I think that the media culture, social media didn't really exist. It was just beginning in its nascent stages, and you could still aggregate an audience of 20 million people on a Wednesday night to watch the show. And I think that from my perspective, and it's just absolutely and totally stunning as many times as I've heard George speak, and my awareness historically of the Japanese internment, to just understand, you know, what my place and my path through life was. I was raised in suburban New Jersey, and my mom was a school teacher in Harlem, and my dad worked for Citibank, so it was a commuter culture. But I think there are a lot of video games. I played a lot of video games as a kid where you get to choose whether you want it to be easy, medium, or hard. And the older I get, the more I realize that I've just been playing it easy. Almost entirely as a result of the fact that I'm a white cisgendered male. And when I was making Lost, I wasn't really aware of any of those things. It was just more like, I want to tell intimate stories about characters. I'm really into sci-fi and time travel. I want people to care. But it wasn't really, I wasn't really thinking with any level of intention about it being a message delivery device. And I think that ultimately we're supposed to make entertainment. And the trick was to Trojan horse your messaging so that it never feels like messaging. I think that probably, given the choice between Hamilton and Allegiance, people are going to say, oh, I'd rather watch Hamilton because they're singing and because...
We sang too.
Yeah, yes. Everyone is telling me to go see Hamilton, and the sort of idea of saying, I'm going to go through this experience, I'm going to look down the barrel of that rifle that was held by someone who looked like me and pointed at someone who looked like George, and I'm going to understand who I am in the world. It's hard, it's tough. And so moving through The Leftovers and now, you know, into the space where I'm thinking as a 45-year-old male is we're tribal in our storytelling. We surround ourselves with people who have common experience and look like us so that we can hang out in a room for 10 or 12 hours a day, and we can be ourselves and say what we want to say without offending anyone. And we want to be the interrupters. We don't want to be the listeners, you know? And that's just the way that I've been programmed from the moment that I was born by virtue of the body that I was born into. And coming with a larger awareness of what my place is and an understanding that I can always do better, I've just become a lot less tribal in the people that I surround myself with and my creative process. And it's not just because I want to make the world a better place, but I want to make my art more authentic by moving it into a space where I'm less comfortable, where I feel like I'm out of my depth and I don't really know what I'm doing. And then that requires me to listen to others. I still have a storytelling instinct. There's still story that I want to tell, but it's always going to come from that perspective of what my life was. And if I'm going to, are we really ultimately solving for white cisgendered males should only tell stories about white cisgendered males? And if the answer to that, I hope, is no, then how do you authentically tell a story not from that perspective? And the answer is you need to do a lot of listening, and then you need to surround yourself with people who you trust, who will not suffer you, you know, who will basically tell you, shut the hell up, you don't know what you're talking about, you know.
We'll interrupt you.
And,
But and so have you actively changed, or I would say, how have you actively changed like your writers' rooms as part of this revelation?
well, on The Leftovers, we always had gender balance in our rooms, true gender balance, 50-50 gender balance, all through the 3 seasons that we did, and we would have 1 or 2 writers of color on The Leftovers, which is not enough because it's tokenism. If you're trying to do, particularly in the 2nd season of Leftovers, which focused on an African-American family, to only have 1 or 2 writers of color in the room, they're never going to take you on. You need to have 3 or 4 so that they look at each other and say, "Are you going to tell him?" You know, are you, and then they will speak up. So now moved into a modality on our latest project where we have a much more diverse room.
Which project is
Yeah,
it?
it's called Watchmen
yeah.
for HBO. It's based on a graphic novel from the 80s, but we're doing something slightly different with it. And there's kind of 10 bodies, you know, in and out of the room at any one time. People leave and come back, but 4 of them are white males and 6 of them aren't. So it's progress. We can always do better. To Sarah's oeuvre, we've hired a number of playwrights. That's always a tricky proposition because some playwrights don't have any previous TV experience, and what you respond to in their writing is their voice, you know. And when you sit in a room with 9 other people, there's this groupthink that starts to emerge where your specific voice and your vision starts to kind of get homogenized. And so there was a conventional thinking back in the Lost days, don't hire playwrights. We've had a tremendous amount of success with the playwrights that we've hired, and they can hopefully go and continue to cultivate their own art, but then also bring their perspective into our room.
And as you approach The Watchmen, which is you know, as a comic book, more of a pop culture sort of potentially more accessible to more people, and sort of had more instant access than something like The Leftovers, do you see that as being a vehicle for a message? Do you approach the sort of the political or cultural messaging in a more direct way than you did back when you weren't thinking about it when you were creating Lost?
I think that there's a lot more intention there. I definitely feel like when I was initially approached about Watchmen 3 or 4 years ago, it was just, you know, here's the comic book, do you want to do this? And my approach to it was, no, you know, this has kind of already been done. They made a movie out of it. Everyone knows what it is. But I do feel like there's a broader world that Watchmen has created that is worthy of exploring. And because there was a psychological realism brought to superheroes in terms of like, shouldn't we be worried about Batman? You know, like, this is the hero. Like, why is Spider-Man wearing a mask? Like, why can't we see his face? Like, what does that represent? And I think, as Sophia mentioned, in a post-Black Panther world where you can make, and Ryan Coogler, who directed that film, and that's why it sparkles with his authenticity, in front of and behind the camera, you have artists of color, but more importantly, he's not Trojan horsing a message inside of a superhero movie. He's finding a way to put it all on the plate so it doesn't feel like you're being pounded about the head and neck with some messaging. It's like no consumer of popular culture, there's just too many options out there to basically say to the viewer, eat your vegetables. You know, you have to put something in front of them that looks tasty. That said, Watchmen, I think, is a very unique comic book in that it's largely credited with changing in the mid-'80s the way that we thought about comics and legitimizing and elevating the genre because it was very political and contemporary to the mid-'80s. That was a time when you know, the United States and Russia might engage in some sort of nuclear holocaust. Now we're best friends. So given the license to take a more contemporary approach and understand what the political landscape is now, and how can superheroes be political? Because it's very strange that we have these superpowered individuals who are just like, we're not political. You would essentially right now we'd be seeing Donald Trump trying to get Superman to shake his hand in the Rose Garden. Of course he would. So I think that the political co-opting of superpowered individuals is really interesting. But more importantly, I think that we can use something that everyone thinks they're familiar with, something called Watchmen, to create the illusion of a big tent show. And our hope is that if we can get them in the tent, they may see something that's relatively unexpected. And it feels risky and dangerous and exciting to me, but who knows what the audience's response is going to be.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of a number of things. I mean, in a very basic way, I think I was listening to George when you were talking about just how you've come to the stage, and it's almost like you laid out an example of what we all are trying to accomplish. That story sparked in me such an empathetic response, you know, having driven by Skid Row, living out on the east side, and I won't be able to drive by any downtown area around there without thinking of you and thinking of your family, because you told that story to us. And so I think, in essence, what we all are trying to do as storytellers, and yes, there's a big industry and there's money to be made, but to move the culture requires this exercise in practicing empathy for things you don't understand. And I think all of the projects that we've, you know, Watchmen, you know, The Leftovers, all of the projects that we work on, it is an opportunity for a viewer to practice caring about individuals or a world or a struggle that previously has felt incredibly foreign to them. And that's just an offshoot of real storytelling that lines up to an authentic experience. I think that's the reason, that's the greater good for our culture, to invest in a diversity of storytellers and the people that are behind the camera, the people that are running the studios and making these decisions, that can shepherd these projects in their most authentic way, is because it's not just because it's our time. It's not because we have, you know, this is the pie of popular culture, and it's been, I don't want to nod at you, but, you know, it has been like maybe fully, mostly given to a certain population.
Nod. Nod it out. Yeah.
Over there. And not, so, but rather, because what it allows us an opportunity to do is invite the entirety of our country and our international viewers to participate in starting to imagine experiences that they don't have. It's basically asking people to work through the idea that they make decisions and they make judgments and they cultivate their aesthetic based on experiential learning, right? If it happened to me, I understand, you know? If my dad lost his job, then I understand what unemployment is, you know? You know, or if my wife, or if my daughter. So if we can move past just, because experiential learning, you know, as long and fruitful as most of our lives hopefully are, it's not going to embody like the as expansive amount of knowledge. I hope this is not too convoluted, but
You're talking about sort of expanding the amount of experiences that people can have empathy about.
Yes, because then it allows their thinking to evolve. It allows their capacity for activism to evolve. And in essence, that's where art is intersecting with the rest of the world. It's because that's, in my estimation, that's the kind of glue, the kind of synapse that we're able to jump.
Well, you know, every generation has the same challenges. I mean, we're going through turbulent times, but the 1960s was a very turbulent time. We had the civil rights movement going. And you know, it was being resisted with attack dogs and fire hoses. We had the Vietnam War going, which was not only going on in Southeast Asia, but it was splitting this country. We had our leaders being assassinated. Yeah. A president was assassinated. The leader of the civil rights movement, the eloquent and powerful Dr. Martin Luther King, was assassinated. The Attorney General, the brother of the president, was being assassinated. And it was in this climate that Star Trek was born. Star Trek is 52 years old. And Gene Roddenberry, who created this series originally, wanted to include a message on its times, in the 60s. He said the Starship Enterprise is a metaphor for Starship Earth, and the strength of the starship is in its diversity, coming together and working in concert as a team. We had the slogan, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. So, you know, he was dealing with the times, within the times, and commenting on it. People from different parts of this starship, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, all over. People with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different races, different faiths, all coming together and working. So, and at the same time, we were entertaining. Gene Roddenberry was a great sci-fi storyteller. And so we told an entertaining story, and at the same time, just watching the show, you got the message. So it's not that we've evolved. It's up to the artist to take its time, be a member of its time, and to be creative and to incorporate that message without lecturing. Just visually looking at Star Trek, you get that message. So it's up to the creativity of the artist and his or her sensitivity to what's going on at that time.
Sophia?
And there's something quite powerful when you think about television. And somebody asked me why, you know, so often people feel like their favorite TV characters are so approachable, but they might shy away from someone who they've only ever seen in the movies. And I'm like, well, when you got to pay like $50 for your whole family to go see a Brad Pitt movie and he's 12 feet tall, you don't feel like you know Brad Pitt. You have to leave your house. You go through a process, right? But for us, the things we create, we're in people's homes. When they have a sick day, we're in bed with them all day. When somebody breaks up with their boyfriend, they call on Brooke Davis. I know this. They talk to me about it. You know, there's really a relationship that you have. And to George's point, and even what you're talking about empathetic learning and breaking down barriers, especially, let's think about our current political climate. So many people are so afraid to ask people questions. People are afraid, I think especially a lot of white people are afraid to ask people of color questions because A, it's not their responsibility to teach you about their experience, and B, you don't know what to say. And there's a really magical thing that happens when the anxiousness of your unawareness or your subconscious prejudice that you may have been raised with can be cut down by getting to know a person and them becoming familiar to you. When you think about the internment camp disaster, how many people got to know a Japanese American through getting to know you? When you think about what Will and Grace did, that wasn't an overtly political show at the time. They're much more political now in their return. But Will and Grace gave an entire nation a way to get to know two great gay guys.
It's okay to be gay.
It is, but nobody had that. And nobody had that. And suddenly people went, oh, I don't have this weird, ambiguous, out of focus vision of the other that means someone is bad or scary. You just get to know and fall in love with somebody who might be really different than somebody you were ever raised to know. And then suddenly voices are getting their due, and now, you know, to Damon's point, writers' rooms are changing, and I love that you're willing to talk about how you're changing the landscape of a writer's room, because I think there are a lot of cisgendered white men who are like, well, if we get diverse, are we all gonna lose our jobs? And it's like, no, but you could just hire a more interesting writer's room. You're not gonna lose your job, you can still have a job, you can still create amazing television. There is a seat at the table for everyone, it's just that everyone who's in previous history been left out of the table is demanding they get a seat too, and we deserve that.
But on top of all of that, there are a couple of factors that are happening right now that are different than what's happened in the past. One is you have the sort of the fragmentation of the news environment, which is something that, you know, I see as a journalist, where if from a political news market, there are more options than ever. So if you have a particular opinion, you can watch news that is targeting you, and that sort of fragments the world. And then the content world is also fragmented because there are more TV shows than ever on more platforms than ever. You don't even have to subscribe to cable TV. You can watch it on Netflix, Hulu, et cetera, Amazon. So there's a fragmentation of the media market as a whole. And then there's also the sort of these things that have happened in the past year, one of which we've referenced is the success of Black Panther, changing the studio assumptions that movies with Black protagonists could be successful, successful in the US or internationally, that smashed that perception. And so there's this realization that there's a sort of Black Panther phenomenon. And then there's also the Time's Up, Me Too movement that is really changing the conversation. And Sophia, I know you're involved in Time's Up, and I'm curious in your time working with them and communicating this message, how you see that changing the conversation around content and having ripple effects.
That's a lot. I think it's been incredibly important to just get the conversation out into the light. The awareness of what's happening, the awareness of the reality that so many people, both men and women, have been cultured when they witness something that might border on inappropriate or that's just grossly inappropriate. There's generally this sort of shame and embarrassment where you're like, ooh, I don't want to touch that, and you figure out a way to get out of the room, whatever. That doesn't fly anymore. And I think it's been really uplifting for so many women who've been fighting that battle, who've been like, yeah, we're the ones who jump in for each other so often, to say everyone else is welcome to this table as well. We need great allies, we need great support, and we need to figure out ways in which this notion of time's up when we're talking about disparity applies not just to women. It applies to people of color, it applies to people who deal with harassment in their workplace because of sexual orientation or preference, whatever. It's a big conversation, and I think that's another reason why people want to shy away from it, because sometimes the really big issues feel insurmountable and people would rather go and watch something uplifting. But what I think is very interesting is that people are more conscientious of who's in a room. People are more willing to listen to what women are saying, and rather than say like, oh, but you're sensitive, it's like, my sensitivity is my superpower. So get on board. It's part of how you make great content. It's part of how you do have conversations that invite empathy. And yes, I do also see a ripple effect of people wanting to make sure the rooms that they are in and that they're putting people in feel better. This sort of insidious layer that everyone ignored because we have a job to do and it's corporate and we have to make money is not being ignored in the same way. And it's nice when there are now examples to offer up where you can say, you can kill it for your corporation, you can make lots of money, and you can protect people. It's actually not that complicated.
In this conversation of Me Too, there's also sometimes for some people a need for self-restraint, because I respect that conversation. Women who have been silenced because of social and cultural forces are finally they're able to speak up and to be listened to. They weren't listened to before, they were shamed. So I respect that conversation, but there's another aspect to it, which I've been victimized by. I've had a single solitary allegation made against me. I'm gay, and this person accused me of drugging him, first of all, which was absolute anathema to me. It's totally reprehensible. And I was accused of drugging him and attempting to have sex with him. I made a statement. I said it's untrue. I don't know the person at all. But I will not engage in a he said conversation because I respect this conversation on the Me Too that's going on. And what I would be doing would be challenging someone who's made an allegation irresponsibly, untruthfully. But if I engage in that conversation, and in social media, we have this thing called trolls and haters, and the story will continue on. And I didn't want to muddy the water with the conversation of Me Too going on. So I made my statement very clearly this guy is clearly an attention hog, and he's been regaling people in gay bars. But I have to restrain myself because of the power of social media to keep an ugly conversation going and alive and muddying the waters.
To your point, Julia, about the ways in which it has changed, the Me Too movement has changed the content, and I'm just somebody who's, more in the developing shows, creating shows, writing. I have found that, thankfully, and maybe this sounds very Pollyannish or super positive, but I have found, thankfully, that there's a hunger for real active ways, there's a hunger to figure out how to change things, how to change the lineup of programming, how to change the ideas of how women are seen on television, how to complicate our protagonists in our storytelling. And the great thing about that is that we're not replacing this idea of now we need more women. We're talking about the ways in which no one woman or one person of color is necessarily responsible for being the mouthpiece for an entire gender, an entire race, an entire sexual representation. So it's diversity within that experience that we're starting to see. And I think that's one of the most positive outcomes of this Me Too conversation. It came from this, from what was happening politically in our country once our president took office, and the banding together of women of multiple perspectives to stand together and to speak up from what is in some ways a shared experience, but there's so many different class perspectives and race perspectives and gendered perspectives that have been overcome in order to kind of found this movement. So it makes me positive, and it feels like the industry is responding in kind.
Yeah.
And audiences are responding.
Well, if the shows are good, which they're going to be good, because if they're authentically told and they're executed by, folks that know what they're doing, then audiences are going to love it, So, yes.
Did you want to say something else?
No, I just was exactly. Just slow clapping over here.
I want to open up to some audience questions, but first I want to tie together this conversation about social. I feel like the impact of social media has been a thread throughout what many of you have been saying. And right now, social media's interaction with content is, obviously allowing folks like yourselves to have a direct voice, a direct communication to your fans, but it's also changing the way we consume content, and that's sort of intersecting with the fact that now you can binge content. When Lost launched, I was just saying, I had to watch it when it first aired, so I didn't hear spoilers at the water cooler the next day. And now content consumption has changed so much with the potential to binge, and that has in turn changed the way that social media has impacted the way people interact with content and talk to you about your shows and tell you what they love and don't love. So how has that impact the binging and the social? How do those two factors interplay in the way you think about what you're doing right now?
It's an excellent question, and one that I can go on ad nauseum, which is in a contradictory spirit of binging itself. But I will just say, we're writers, storytellers, words matter, and it's always been very interesting to me that we selected the word binge to describe this behavior, where prior to the idea of consuming media for many consecutive hours, no one has ever used that word as a good thing prior to it. You just basically I bought an entire can of Pringles and I ate every single last one of them. And so the question is, how are we packaging these things? And so if Netflix basically says we're going to put all 10 episodes of Stranger Things on simultaneously, and here they are, versus packaging them in responsible portions, we can't actually be trusted to not get addicted to these things. Social media is designed to be addictive. Our phones are designed to be addictive. Online pornography is designed to be addictive. And there's no sort of larger awareness in terms of how responsible we are as storytellers. When we were making Lost, it was on Wednesday nights, and you watched it for an hour, and then the next Wednesday night there would be another one. And the way that we kept you addicted to that show was each episode would end with a cliffhanger. And even if you were starting to get frustrated with the fact that they weren't getting off the goddamn island, you were just sort of like, I kind of need to see sort of how they resolve this thing. And now the idea of, to mix it into the social conversation, and then I'll be quiet, is there's social cachet in watching these things and having seen them all. So as we were walking over from the Step and Repeat, we were Sophia and I were talking about Wild Wild Country, which is now social cachet in Los Angeles. Right. You have to have seen Wild Wild Country. All the writers in the Watchmen room have seen it, and I literally have to say I've only seen the first 3. Should I leave the room so you guys can all talk about it? But it's become this sort of essential viewing, and the fact of the matter is they make all the episodes. You know, if you want to commit 8 hours of your life and watch it all immediately, I like to consume media. Pardon me for sounding a bit old-fashioned, in sort of bite-sized compartments. I want to digest it. I also don't want to just commit to that one show for the next 3 days of my life. You know, I'm curating multiple shows. There's shows that I watch with my wife that we enjoy together, and then there are shows that I watch by myself. And I like that I can only watch Westworld on Sunday nights, and that's the only way to watch it. And you know, and when people come up to me and say, I watched all 3 seasons of The Leftovers in a week, I know they're not trying to be insulting, but it's the equivalent of like going to have into a 5-star restaurant, and you just say to the chef, bring it all now. Bring it all now. And I'm going to eat it in 10 minutes. And I'm going to tell you how great it was. There is something a little bit in like, we just spent like 2 years making this for you. Like, slow down.
There's not enough time
but I also,
Yeah.
but I also feel like, you know, Clint Eastwood shaking my fist at the neighborhood in Gran Torino, where you know, it's like, shut up, Damon. You know, times have passed you by.
I could definitely keep going with this conversation, but I want to see if there are any audience questions. Anyone? Because I've got some more. One right here.
Hi, Lieutenant Megan Wilkins, United States Navy. I have 2 comments. The first is not a question, just a comment. The second is a question. First to George. I am super inspired by your story, and I think it's amazing that you had that experience in your early years as an American citizen, and I'm truly sorry that was the face that America chose to show you at that time in your life. But I find your story going from that and becoming what you are now, and being able to very publicly be open about your sexuality, you've been a huge impact on people, and so you've taken something that was not something that America should be proud of and turned it into something really awesome. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
For Sophia, I think it's really inspiring how you said that you're very critical about the scripts that come across your desk and the message, ultimately, that you are presenting to the public. I think it's awesome. I do think that that's not the same thing that all actors and actresses follow, and I know that humanity just at the core can be greedy, and I know it's a business, so people are trying to make money and further their career, and I understand that. But how do we try to instill the same sort of cause that you're working towards throughout the rest of other actors and actresses, and try to instill that in them?
Well, I think it's incredibly inspiring to see how many people have really thrown caution to the wind and gotten politically active in our industry. I think, as we referenced earlier, making art and entertainment has always been pretty political. But yeah, there is a business side to it. I referenced that I don't particularly love movies that, to me, I would describe like torture porn. Some people really love gory horror movies. It's like their thing. And I think they should go make those movies all day, because I don't have to make them and I don't have to watch them. I'm like, you do you. So I'd never want to act as though what I've figured out works for me, I believe everybody needs to subscribe to. I do think that, to your point, the more of us who do things like this, the more of us who are in positions of any relative power or who have platforms get out there and say, hey, I'm doing this and it hasn't ruined my career, it hasn't ruined my life. I'm still here working and I still pay my mortgage by playing pretend, which is stupendous. It's an example setting, really. And I think that, you know, when people 10 years ago were like, you cannot do this. You cannot be so political. You have to calm down. I was like, look at Jane Fonda, watch me. You know, I had an example. And I think that that's really the first step. And I also, again, for me, it feels like a responsibility. If it doesn't feel that way for other people, like, you do you, you know? But I do see even you referencing the impact that George's story and the way he's chosen to live his life and the way that he's been an activist for so long has inspired you. I feel the same. You know, like the first time he tweeted back at me, I was like, oh my God! I had like a total moment. And now like there's been a banter on the internet for years. But I think it only takes one person who can wake you up. And you know, if I've done that for one person, great. And hopefully the more of us who are willing to have these conversations in public-facing ways, we can do the same.
Great. Well, thank you for using the influence that comes with your nature of work to do a greater good. I appreciate that.
And we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask one really quick last question, which is sort of in the wake of all of this, post-Black Panther, do you see the big public companies who you all work with changing the way they think about being political or addressing social and cultural issues? And maybe I'll throw this to Damon.
Without a doubt, the intention is there. The action has yet to sort of manifest itself, and I think that my largest concern about the future of our business is representation in the executive suite. Yes. I think that if we just basically look at the faces and genders of the most powerful hands on the levers in media companies, there's still disproportionately, if not exclusively, white men. And if that starts to change, then I think that we're going to start to see a tectonic shift in media culture.
Yeah. That seems like a good note to end on. They're wrapping us up. So Damon, Sarah, George, and Sophia, thank you all so much for joining us.